They say the Thornwood never forgets a soul. Not a name, not a title. A soul. The kind the earth recognizes before the person does. The kind that leaves a warmth in the roots long after the body has passed over them. The oldest foresters spoke of it in low voices, the way people speak of things they believe but cannot prove. That somewhere, always, the land was waiting, patient as stone, quiet as deep water, that it would know her when she came. Marin Ashgrove was 77 years old, and the world had spent most of those years looking at her the way people look at furniture, present, unremarkable, easily forgotten. No mate had ever spoken her name to the moon, no mark had ever burned on her skin. She had walked the edge of the Holt borderlands her entire life, tending her animals, filling her jars, growing old in a silence that the village had decided long ago was the only thing she deserved. She had stopped arguing with that decision. She should not have, because on the other side of those woods, a king was unraveling something he had spent 80 years holding together. A kingdom that had been ruled, for too long, by ambition wearing the face of love. His daughter Eloise was moving her pieces across the board with the patience of someone who had never once doubted she would win. She had not accounted for a storm. She had not accounted for 4 white wolf pups with absolutely no sense of direction, and an unexpected gift for finding the one person in the entire territory they were never supposed to find. And she had not accounted for what the Thornwood had already decided, long before any of them arrived at that hollow between the oaks. The land had chosen. It had been waiting, quietly, for 77 years. And on the morning the pups came running through the rain, crying, lost, following something none of them could name. The waiting, finally, irrevocably, ended. What the woods had been keeping was about to be revealed, and it would change everything. If you love intense wolf stories with destiny and twists, go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now. So, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapters. And how about we get to know each other better? I'm Maggie Reed, the author of these stories, and you? Drop a comment below with your name and what city you're watching from. The morning air over Ashfin village carried the particular cruelty of early autumn, sharp enough to sting the cheeks, cold enough to remind a body of every year it had lived. Marin Ashgrove felt each one of her 77 years in the slow ache of her knees as she climbed the narrow path behind the market square, a woven basket balanced against her hip, and the familiar weight of invisible eyes pressing into her back. She did not look behind her. She had learned, long ago, that looking back only gave people the satisfaction of knowing they had landed their blow. The whispers had started before she even reached the herb stalls. There she goes, old Marin. Did you hear? The Whitmore family's youngest found her mate last night, 15 years old and already claimed. A pause, then lower, designed precisely to carry. Some of us wait our whole lives, and the moon never calls our name. And the princess? Another voice added, barely a breath. They say Eloise Holt has already chosen the heir. The pups aren't even a year old and she's already decided their future. Marin adjusted the basket on her hip and kept walking. Her boots found the familiar stones of the path without her needing to look down. She knew every crack, every uneven edge, every place where the cobblestones dipped and filled with rainwater after a storm. She had been walking this same path for over 50 years, since the day her parents had quietly stopped introducing her at gatherings and started leaving her name off invitation lists altogether. It was not hatred exactly what the village felt for her. Hatred required effort. What Ashfin offered Marin was something quieter and, in many ways, more exhausting, a collective forgetting. She was the woman who had never been chosen, the Omega who had reached the age of mating and found nothing. No mate, no mark, no moon-called name whispered in the dark. And then another year had passed, and another, and the village had simply moved on without her, the way a river moves around a stone, smoothly, without acknowledgement, without ceremony. She was 77 years old, and she had never once been told she was wanted. The thought did not make her cry. It hadn't made her cry in a very long time. What it did, still, even now, was settle into the hollow beneath her sternum like a smooth river rock. Present, familiar, something she carried because she had no choice. Marin set her basket down beside the low wooden gate of her cottage and paused, breathing in the morning. This, at least, was hers. The small stone house at the edge of the village where the cobblestones gave way to moss, and the moss gave way to the deep, breathing dark of the Ashvin woods. The garden that spilled in cheerful defiance over every boundary she had tried to set for it. The smell of wet earth and dried lavender and something wilder underneath. Pine resin, fox musk, the green dark exhale of old trees, and the animals. A barn owl blinked at her from the low branch of the rowan tree beside the gate, its disc face solemn and unbothered. 2 foxes, the mother she had nursed through a broken leg 2 winters ago and her half-grown kit, watched from beneath the bramble hedge with amber eyes full of patient expectation. Somewhere in the small stone enclosure behind the cottage, she could hear the low shuffling of the 3-legged deer she had been feeding since midsummer, his velvet nose no doubt already pointed toward the gate. "Good morning," Marin said, to all of them, and none of them specifically. The owl ruffled its feathers. One of the foxes stood and stretched. The deer made a soft sound that might, generously, have been interpreted as a greeting. This was her family. It always had been. She unlatched the gate and stepped through, and the morning gathered itself around her the way it always did. Quietly, without fuss, as though the world just beyond the village's memory was gentler than the one inside it. She hung the basket on its hook beside the door and began her rounds, moving through the familiar rhythms of feeding and checking and murmuring soft words to each creature in her care. It was during the feeding of the deer, whose name was Birch, because he had stumbled out of the birch grove half dead and decided her garden was a reasonable place to recover, that she first felt it. A shift in the air. Nothing she could have explained to anyone in the village. Nothing that would have made sense in the language of ordinary things. But Marin had spent 77 years listening to the woods, and the woods had their own vocabulary, and right now they were saying something she had not heard before. Something is coming. She straightened slowly, one hand still resting on Birch's warm flank, and turned to face the tree line. The Ashvin woods stood at the edge of her garden in their usual dense silence, the old oaks and ash trees so thick with age that the light barely reached their roots even in summer. Beyond them, she knew, the territory shifted, crossed into the borderlands of the Holt Kingdom, old land, royal land, land that common folk like her had no business approaching. She had never approached it. She had simply lived beside it for 5 decades, near enough to feel its breath on cold mornings, far enough to stay forgotten. The feeling grew. Not danger. She had learned to recognize danger in the way the foxes froze and the owl went silent. This was something else. A pull, like a thread tugging gently at the center of her chest, insistent and confused, as though whatever was on the other end of it did not quite know where it was going but was moving toward her anyway. Marin frowned. The first sound she heard was small, a whimper, high and thin, swallowed almost immediately by the wind. Then another. Then something that could only be described as a very small, very unhappy howl, the kind that came from a throat that had not yet grown large enough to produce a proper one. She was through the garden gate and moving toward the tree line before she had consciously decided to do so. The woods closed around her in their familiar way, the light shifting from pale gold to deep green, the ground softening beneath her boots. She followed the sounds which were growing more distinct now, not one voice but several, overlapping, each one carrying its own particular flavor of distress. She found them in the hollow between 2 ancient oaks, huddled in a shivering mass of white fur and mud and trembling indignation. 4 wolf pups, white as new snow, or they would have been, without the liberal coating of forest debris that currently adorned them. The largest was trying to maintain what appeared to be a dignified posture and failing completely, his small legs unsteady beneath him. The smallest had wedged himself so thoroughly into the gap between two roots that only his back half was visible, his tail a frantic blur. The third had stationed himself at what he clearly believed was a threatening distance from Marin and was producing a sound that aspired to be a growl, but landed somewhere closer to an anxious squeak. The fourth was asleep. Deeply, profoundly, incomprehensibly asleep. Curled in a ball in the mud while his brothers fell apart around him, his round belly rising and falling with the serenity of someone who had simply decided that this was not his emergency. Marin stopped. She looked at them for a long moment. Then, very slowly, she crouched down to their level. "Well," she said quietly, "you are a long way from wherever you're supposed to be." The one attempting the growl stopped mid-squeak and stared at her. His eyes, pale silver, startlingly clear for something so small and filthy, held hers for a moment, and she felt it again, that thread pull in her chest, stronger now, warm in a way she had no language for. The smallest one, still wedged between the roots, let out a muffled sound of protest. Marin set down her hand, palm up, on the moss between them. She did not reach. She did not push. She simply waited, the way she always waited, because she had learned that frightened creatures needed to believe the choice was theirs. It was the sleepy one who moved first. He uncurled, yawned enormously, revealing an impressive number of tiny teeth, and then walked directly across the clearing and stepped onto her palm as though he had been doing so his entire short life. He was warm. Impossibly, wonderfully warm. Marin felt something shift inside her chest, old and locked and long since accepted as permanent, and she did not have words for what it was, only that it moved. She was still kneeling in the moss, the sleepy pup drowsing against her palm and the others creeping cautiously closer, when she heard the sound of something large moving through the trees behind her. Not a wolf. Something walking upright. Something that moved with the particular cadence of a person who had spent a lifetime commanding every room they entered, even apparently a forest in the rain. The sleepy pup, Rook, opened one eye and thumped his tail once without apparent concern. Marin did not stand. She kept her hand steady and her breathing even, and she waited, and the footsteps came closer, and then stopped. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. "Those," said a low voice behind her, rough with age and something else, something she couldn't name. "Are my grandchildren." Marin turned her head slowly. The man standing at the edge of the hollow was tall, broad through the shoulders despite the years that had rounded them slightly, his silver hair damp from the rain, and his dark eyes fixed on her with an expression she had absolutely no framework for interpreting. He was looking at her the way the animals looked at her, like she was something that did not fit the category he had prepared, like she was something he had not expected to find, and was not yet sure what to do about. Rook yawned again and went back to sleep on her palm. "I see," Marin said, because she had learned that when you had nothing else, plain words were enough. "Then I suppose you had better come and get them." The man took one step into the hollow, then another, and something in the ancient air between the two oaks hummed, low and barely perceptible, like a note struck on a string no one had touched in a very long time. Neither of them spoke again for a long moment, and the woods, which had been holding their breath, slowly let it go. The man did not move like someone accustomed to waiting. Marin could see it in the set of his jaw, in the way his hands, large, weathered, the hands of someone who had once worked hard and never quite lost the shape of it, stayed very still at his sides with the particular effort of a person who wanted to do something with them and was choosing not to. He stood at the edge of the hollow and looked at the four pups with an expression that moved through relief, exasperation, and something painfully close to tenderness, all in the space of a single breath. Then he looked at her again. She still hadn't stood up. Her knees were reminding her, with some urgency, that 77 years on this earth had opinions about kneeling on cold moss, but she stayed where she was, because Rook was still asleep on her palm, and she had not yet decided it was time to disturb him. "You should not be this deep in the woods," the man said. His voice was the kind that had given orders for so long it had forgotten how to make requests. "The borderlands between Ashfin and the Holt territory are not safe for—" He stopped. Marin raised an eyebrow at him and said nothing. He had the decency to look faintly uncomfortable. "For anyone traveling alone," he finished, which was not what he had started to say, and they both knew it. "I live at the edge of these woods," Marin said. "I have walked them for 50 years. They have yet to harm me." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, more like a man recalibrating, quietly adjusting the shape of the thing in front of him to match what he was actually seeing rather than what he had assumed. Cinder, the largest pup, the one who had been attempting dignity, chose this precise moment to approach Marin's knee, sniff it with great seriousness, and then sit down directly on her boot as though planting a flag. The man watched this happen. A muscle moved in his jaw. Cinder. Cinder looked at his grandfather with the expression of someone who had heard his name and was actively choosing not to acknowledge it. "He's been sitting on my boot for about 2 minutes, Marin said, with perfect neutrality. "I don't think he intends to stop." "He does that." The man pressed 2 fingers briefly to the bridge of his nose. "They all do something." "That one," a gesture toward Fletch, who had retreated to a safe distance and was now growling bravely at a fallen leaf, "challenges everything he encounters and then acts confused when it doesn't immediately surrender." "And that one?" Marin nodded toward the gap between the roots, where Moat's back half was still visible, his tail now wagging despite his invisible front half being apparently stuck. "That one," the man said with the exhausted weight of someone who had said this many times, "finds his way into every place he shouldn't fit and then requires assistance to exit." He crossed the hollow in 3 strides, crouched beside the roots with considerably more grace than a man of 80 had any right to, and gently worked Moat free from the gap. Moat emerged with a twig caught between his ears, a look of absolute triumph on his face, and a small, unidentified object in his mouth that was very definitely not from these woods. The man stared at the object. "That is my pocket watch." Moat's tail went into full rotation. "He took your pocket watch," Marin said, "while he was stuck in a tree root. Apparently. That's actually impressive." The man looked at her. And then, briefly, like sunlight through cloud cover, there and gone before it fully registered, something in his face came close to a smile. He straightened, Moat tucked under one arm and pocket watch reclaimed, and for the first time seemed to take in the full picture. Marin kneeling in the moss, Rook asleep on her palm, Cinder stationed on her boot, Fletch still locked in mortal combat with the leaf. The rain had started again, a soft, persistent drizzle that turned the hollow silver, and Marin's gray braid was beginning to fray at the edges, and she was aware, with no particular distress, that she looked exactly like what she was, an old woman who had followed strange sounds into the woods and found something she hadn't expected. "How long have they been with you?" His tone had changed. Not softer exactly, but the order had gone out of it. "Perhaps 20 minutes. I heard them from my garden." She glanced down at Rook, who had not stirred. "This one found me immediately. The others took a little longer to decide I was acceptable." He has never done that before. He was looking at Rook with an unreadable expression. "Gone to a stranger?" "Animals usually know," Marin said simply. "Know what?" She considered the question. "Whether a person is safe." The silence that followed was different from the first one. That one had had weight. This one had texture, something she could almost feel against her skin, warm despite the rain, unfamiliar in a way that made the back of her neck prickle. The man looked at her for a long moment. Then, without ceremony, he sat down in the moss across from her. Not crouched, not hovering, sat, with the deliberate decision of someone choosing to be at eye level. It was, Marin thought, a surprisingly humble thing for a king to do, because she had recognized him. It had taken her a few minutes. She had spent very little time in the parts of Ashfin where people discussed royal affairs, and she was not in the habit of studying the faces of men who would never have occasion to look at her. But she had recognized him. King Edin Holt, the ruler of the territory that began where her woods ended. She had heard his name her whole life, the way you heard weather reports, relevant in the abstract, rarely personal. She did not say she recognized him. It did not seem like the most important thing about this particular moment. "I'm Marin," she said instead. He looked at her as though the simplicity of this had briefly disarmed him. "Edin. Not king, not your majesty. Just the name, offered back with the same plainness she had used, and Marin filed this away without comment. Rook chose this moment to wake up, sneeze magnificently, and look around with the expression of someone who had absolutely no idea how he had ended up on a stranger's palm, but was prepared to accept it as the natural order of things. He looked at Edin. He looked at Marin. He licked her thumb with great deliberateness and went back to sleep. "I apologize," Edin said, with what sounded like genuine resignation. "For all of them." "Don't." Marin looked down at the small sleeping weight in her hand, and the feeling in her chest, the one she had no words for, moved again, deeper this time. "They're wonderful." Something in Edrin's face went very still. He was not, she thought, a man who heard that word applied to things that belonged to him very often. It was Fletch who broke the moment, having concluded his battle with the leaf, and now returning to the group with the swaggering energy of a conquering hero. He marched directly to the center of the hollow, looked at the assembled company, and produced a howl of celebration that started strong, wobbled in the middle, and ended in an unconvincing squeak that he immediately pretended had not happened. Everyone in the hollow looked at Fletch. Fletch looked back with absolute dignity. "He does that too," Edin said. "I assumed," Marin said. And this time, the thing that happened in Edrin's face completed itself. It was a real smile, brief and unused looking, like something taken out of storage after a long time, and it changed him entirely. And Marin felt it land somewhere in the region of that locked hollow beneath her sternum, warm and unexpected and slightly alarming. She was 77 years old and she had absolutely no idea what to do with that. She was spared the need to figure it out immediately, because the sound of crashing undergrowth from the northern tree line announced the arrival of someone who was either very large or very bad at moving quietly through a forest. Given that it was accompanied by urgent muttering and the snap of at least 4 separate branches, Marin suspected the latter. A man burst into the hollow, red-faced, slightly askew, one boot darker than the other from what appeared to be an encounter with a puddle. He was perhaps 60, with the look of someone who had once had a dignified bearing and was currently losing track of it at speed. In one hand, he held a map that the rain had rendered largely decorative. In the other, inexplicably, he held half a meat pie. He saw Edin. He saw Marin. He saw the pups. He looked at the meat pie as though surprised to find it still in his hand. "I," he announced breathlessly, "have been looking for you for 45 minutes. "Oswin," Edin said. "I fell in a stream." "I can see that." "I would like it noted that the map," Oswin held up the disintegrating parchment, "is useless. Whoever drew this map had clearly never been in this forest, and was, I suspect, guessing. You drew that map." A pause. "I would like it noted that I drew this map under significant time pressure." He finally seemed to fully register Marin, kneeling in the moss, a sleeping wolf pup on her palm, thoroughly unbothered by all of this. He blinked at her. He looked at Edin. He looked back at Marin with the expression of a man whose brain was working very hard and arriving at conclusions he hadn't prepared for. "Hello?" Marin said pleasantly. "Hello," Oswin said with great caution, as though she might be a forest spirit, and he was trying not to commit to anything. Cinder, still stationed on Marin's boot, looked up at Oswin with the weary authority of someone who had already assessed the situation and found it adequately managed. Oswin looked at the pup. He looked at the meat pie. In a gesture that somehow contained both offering and apology, he tore a small piece and held it toward Cinder. Cinder sniffed it, considered, then accepted it with great dignity, as though doing Oswin a favor. "Right," Oswin said, to no one in particular. "I see how it is." The rain came down a little harder, and the hollow filled with the smell of wet earth and pine and something sweeter underneath, something Marin had no name for, that seemed to be coming from the direction of the man sitting across from her in the moss, watching her with those dark, recalibrating eyes. "You should come inside," Marin said, before she had entirely decided to. "All of you. Until the rain passes." She felt Edrin's attention sharpen, not the order-giving kind of sharp, but the kind that came when a person heard something they had not expected and were deciding whether to trust it. "We wouldn't want to impose," Oswin began. "You're already wet," Marin said. "The imposition has occurred." Oswin opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the meat pie, apparently for guidance. Then, with the air of a man accepting the inevitable, "She has a point." Edin stood and offered his hand to help Marin to her feet. She looked at it for a moment, this large, weathered, unexpected hand extended toward her in the rain, and felt something she recognized distantly as the sensation of a thing changing. Not dramatically, not all at once. The way a lock turns, small, precise, and then suddenly open. She took his hand. She stood. Her knees registered their usual complaints. Rook, transferred smoothly to the crook of her other arm, slept through all of it. They walked out of the hollow together, the 4 pups tumbling around their feet, Oswin bringing up the rear and already explaining to Fletch why the leaf had not, technically, been defeated. And the woods watched them go, the way old things watch new things begin, with patience and without surprise. Marin's cottage had not hosted guests in 11 years. She knew this precisely because the last time had been the winter that old Dara the herb seller had twisted her ankle on the icy road, and accepted, with visible reluctance, Marin's offer of a warm seat and a cup of something strong. Dara had stayed exactly 40 minutes, drunk her tea without looking directly at Marin, and left with a politeness so careful it was almost indistinguishable from pity. After that, Marin had stopped offering. The cottage did not look like a place that received guests. It looked like a place that had grown entirely according to its own logic. Dried herbs hanging in dense bundles from the low beams, jars of salves and tinctures lined along the window ledge in the particular order that made sense only to Marin, a reading chair positioned with ruthless precision beside the hearth, a table that currently held a half-finished bowl of acorn mash she had been preparing for the deer, and a small injured wren in a shallow box of cotton grass. The walls had absorbed decades of wood smoke and lavender, and the whole space smelled like the inside of something ancient and alive. It was, Marin had always felt, a very honest house. It did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. She was thinking about this, about honesty, about what 4 wolf pups and a king and a soaking wet advisor would make of a very honest house, as she pushed open the door and stepped inside, and then she stopped thinking about it because Moat walked directly into the wren's box. "Oh!" Marin moved without thinking, scooping the wren's box to safety with one hand, while Moat looked up at her from inside the cotton grass with an expression of complete serenity, as though he had always intended to be exactly here. "Moat," Edin said from the doorway in the tone of a man who had given up being surprised. Moat wagged. "The bird is injured," Marin said to the pup, with the patient firmness she used for animals who did not yet understand the rules. "She is not a toy, she is not a bed, and she is not something to put in your mouth. Do you understand?" Moat considered this with great seriousness. Then he stepped out of the box, sat beside it, and looked at the wren with what could only be described as respectful curiosity. "Did he just—" Oswin began, from somewhere behind Edrin. "Yes," Edrin said. "They don't usually do that. For me." "No," Edrin said. "They don't." Marin set the wren's box on the highest shelf and turned to properly take in the state of her cottage, which now contained 4 wet wolf pups, 1 king, and 1 advisor, the latter of whom was dripping on her threshold with the expression of a man trying to be smaller than he was. "Come in," she said. "Close the door. The fire is low, but it will take." She moved to the hearth without ceremony, adding wood with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 10,000 times. And behind her she heard the sounds of 4 pups discovering a new space. The particular combination of clicking claws on flagstone, investigative sniffing, and the soft thump of Rook apparently finding a rug to his satisfaction. "This is—" Oswin started. He seemed to be looking around the cottage with genuine attention. "There are a great many jars." "Yes. What's in them?" "Different things. The blue ones are for pain. The green ones are for infection. The amber ones are for—" She paused, because Fletch had found the amber jars on the low shelf and was staring at them with the focused intensity of someone planning something. "Those are not for wolves," she said firmly, without turning around, and Fletch sat down and looked at the ceiling. Oswin made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but wanted to be. Marin filled the kettle and hung it over the newly revived fire, and when she turned around she found Edin standing in the middle of the cottage, which was not a large space, and the fact of him in it was substantial. Not threatening. Just present in a way that changed the proportions of things. He was looking at the walls, specifically at the long shelf that ran above the window, where Marin kept the things she had accumulated over a lifetime of solitary living. A crow's feather, perfectly preserved. A smooth river stone with a natural hole through its center. 3 small figures carved from driftwood. A dried flower crown that no one had ever put on her head because it had been given to her not by a person, but by a deer, draped over her garden post. On a May morning she had never been able to explain. "You made these?" Edrin's voice was quiet. "The carvings, yes. The rest were given to me." "By whom?" She looked at him steadily. "By the animals." He held her gaze for a moment, and she waited for the expression she usually received at this point in the conversation. Polite skepticism, or the specific kind of gentleness people used when they thought someone was slightly unhinged. What she got instead was something thoughtful, attentive, like a man who had spent a long time in a world that rewarded performance and had just encountered something that wasn't performing at all. "The root call," he said quietly. The word landed in Marin's chest like a stone in still water. She kept her face even. "Where did you hear that word?" "My mother spoke of it." Edrin moved to the chair she gestured toward and settled into it with the careful ease of someone who had learned not to let people see when their body was tired. She said it was old magic, that there were souls, very rare, to whom the living world spoke directly. Animals, forests, rivers, that those souls carried something the earth recognized. "People in Ashvin call it something less flattering," Marin said. "They say I smell like a barn." Oswin, who had been attempting to quietly wring out the hem of his jacket by the door, made a sound of muffled indignation on her behalf. "You do smell like a forest," Edrin said, with a directness that was not unkind. "But not a barn." Marin turned to the kettle because her face was doing something she did not want witnessed. She poured the tea, a blend of dried chamomile and something sharper underneath, wild thyme and a hint of juniper, and set 2 cups on the table and 1 on the hearth edge for Oswin, who accepted it with the reverence of a man who had needed it for some time. Cinder had settled at Edrin's feet. Fletch was now staring at the ceiling with focused intensity, as though something up there required monitoring. Moat had produced from somewhere a dried sprig of lavender from the low-hanging bundles, and was carrying it around with the solemnity of someone in a procession. And Rook was asleep on the rug in front of the fire, taking up considerably more space than his size warranted, his paws twitching in whatever dream had claimed him. They were frightened, Edin said, watching them. In the storm, we were traveling the northern pass in a covered carriage. I take them out when I can, let them run in the borderlands. They are too confined at court. A pause. We all are. He said the last 3 words with the flatness of a fact, not a complaint. But Marin heard what was underneath it the way she heard what was underneath animal sounds. The thing the surface was covering. How long have they been with you? She asked. Since they were 3 weeks old. Their mother, he stopped. Something moved across his face, brief and complicated. Their mother, my daughter, Eloise, decided the pups were an inconvenience to other plans she had in motion. She sent them to me. Marin thought of Eloise. She did not say the name. She waited. I don't regret it, Edin added, with a firmness that suggested he had argued with himself about this many times and arrived at the same place each time. They are wonderful, Marin said. And again, the word did something to him. She watched it happen, the slight intake of breath, the stillness, the way his hands loosened around the teacup, as though something he had been gripping had briefly let go. You said that before. I meant it both times. Outside, the rain had deepened from a drizzle to a proper downpour, and the sound of it against the cottage roof was the low, even sound of something that intended to stay a while. The fire had built itself into a good, steady heat. The pups were settling. Even Fletch had given up on the ceiling and was now curled beside Cinder, their white fur drying slowly in the warmth. Oswin had found, with no apparent guidance, the small stool near the window and had settled on it with his tea and the quiet gratitude of a man who had been on his feet too long. He was looking around the cottage with an expression Marin recognized, not pity, not skepticism, but the particular look of someone recalibrating their understanding of a person they had already formed an opinion about. You live here alone, Edin said. It was not quite a question. Yes. Always? Since I was old enough to set up my own household. She wrapped both hands around her teacup. In Ashvin, unmated omegas are not encouraged to take up much space. I found space here instead. The fire popped. The rain pressed against the windows. Edin looked at her with those dark, recalibrating eyes, and she looked back without flinching, because she had 77 years of practice at not flinching, and she was not about to stop now. The borderlands between your village and my territory, he said carefully, are technically under Holt Kingdom protection. That means this cottage has been here longer than most of the laws you're about to cite, Marin said pleasantly. Oswin pressed his lips together very hard. Edin looked at her for a moment. I was going to say, with a patience that had a shape to it, like something carved slowly, that it means you are technically under my protection as well, whether anyone has bothered to tell you that or not. The silence that followed was very full. Marin set down her cup. She looked at this man, this old, tired, complicated man sitting in her reading chair with his borrowed cup of tea and 4 wolf pups asleep around his feet, and felt that thread pull again, deeper than before, settling somewhere it intended to stay. No one, she said quietly, has ever said anything like that to me. Edin did not look away. Then it has been said badly, and too late, and I intend to say it plainly. You have been living on the edge of my land for decades, and no one in my court was paying enough attention. That is a failure I would like to correct. Moat chose this exact moment to walk across the table, drape the lavender sprig ceremonially in front of Marin's cup, and sit down facing her with the solemnity of someone completing an ancient ritual. Everyone looked at Moat. I believe, Oswin said carefully, that he just gave you a gift. He does that, Edin said. For the 3rd time, the smile came, and this time it stayed a moment longer before it went. Marin looked down at the small lavender sprig. Her chest ached with something she had no language for, had never had language for, because language required experience, and she had not had this experience before. Being seen, being claimed, gently, by something that had nothing to gain from it. She picked up the lavender sprig. "Thank you, Moat," she said softly. Moat's tail moved like a small, happy storm, and outside, beneath the sound of the rain, beneath the creak of the old cottage settling into the warmth, there was something else, a low hum in the foundation stones, in the ancient roots beneath the floor, in the place where the root call lived and waited, and had for 77 years been entirely patient. It was no longer waiting. He came back the next morning. Marin discovered this the way she discovered most things, through the animals. The barn owl turned its head toward the garden gate at precisely the moment she was hanging the first bundle of fresh-cut rosemary on the drying line. And when she followed its gaze, she found Edin Holt standing outside her fence with the contained, slightly uncertain posture of a man who had made a decision and was now committed to it, but had not entirely worked out the next part. He was alone. No Oswin, no Pups. They had left the previous evening when the rain finally eased, the 4 pups loaded with considerably more difficulty than they'd arrived with, Moat having hidden himself inside Marin's herb basket and needing to be located and extracted before departure. Edin had said goodnight at her gate with the same plainness he'd offered everything else, and she had watched them go down the path toward the Holt borderlands until the dark swallowed them, and then she had stood at her gate for a moment longer than made sense before going inside. She had told herself it was because the air had been particularly good last night. She had not entirely believed herself. "You came back," she said now, from the drying line. "I have questions." He said it like a man who had practiced the sentence. "About the root call, about what you know of it. There are things happening in the borderlands that my court cannot explain, and 2 of my advisors have separately mentioned an Omega in Ashvin who—" He stopped. "Who the creatures obey?" "The creatures don't obey me," Marin said. She moved to the next bundle on the line, unhurried. "They trust me. That's different." "How?" She thought about it. Obedience is about power. Trust is about something earned? Something recognized? She glanced at him over her shoulder. "Your wolf pups trusted me before you did." "I trusted you." "You trusted me with the pups," Marin said. "That's a smaller thing." He was quiet for a moment, which she was beginning to understand was how he processed things he couldn't immediately counter. "May I come in?" he asked. She unlatched the gate without answering, which was answer enough. They walked the garden together, or rather Marin walked it in the way she always did, stopping to check on the 3-legged deer and murmur something to the foxes who were watching from beneath the hedge, and Edin walked beside her in the way of someone who had not walked slowly in a very long time and was relearning it. She watched him take in the garden with the look of a man being given something he hadn't asked for and wasn't sure he deserved. "Tell me about the borderlands," she said. He was quiet for a breath, and she felt him deciding something. How much, she thought. Not whether. He had already decided whether, or he wouldn't be here. 3 months ago, the old Thornwood at the northern edge of Holt territory began dying, he said. Not from blight, not from drought. The foresters say the roots are intact, the soil is sound, the water table is unchanged, but the trees are going quiet. Going quiet, Marin repeated. That is how my head forester described it. He said, and he is not a man given to fanciful language, that the forest used to feel alive, responsive, that when you walked it, you could feel the ground pushing back against your feet, that it has stopped doing that. Marin stopped walking. She stood very still among her garden herbs, the October light coming thin and gold through the rowan tree, and she felt something move through her. Not fear, but recognition. The feeling of a word you have always known being said out loud for the first time. The root call, she said. It's not just in individuals, It's inland. My mother believed that, Edin said. She believed that certain territories were alive in a way that went beyond nature, that they required a keeper, someone with a root soul, someone the land would speak to and through. He paused. She believed the Holt territory had one once, long ago, and that the line was broken. When? He looked at her. She didn't say, but she said when the land found its keeper again, the Thornwood would remember itself. The rowan tree above them shifted in a wind Marin couldn't feel anywhere else in the garden. She was 77 years old, and she had lived at the edge of the Holt territory her entire life, and she had never once been invited into it. She had assumed this was the natural order of things, that the woods were there, and she was here, and the space between them was not hers to cross. She was beginning to understand, with a clarity that felt like cold water on the face, that this assumption had been incorrect. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because," Edin said, with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing each word, "I have spent 80 years letting other people make decisions that should have been mine, and then living inside the consequences. I am trying, very late, I understand that, to do something different." The foxes had emerged from beneath the hedge. The larger one, the mother, whom Marin had named Bryn after the sound she made when pleased, walked directly to Edrin's feet and sat down, looking up at him with those amber eyes. Edin looked down at her. "Hello," he said, after a moment, with the slightly uncertain tone of a man who did not often speak to foxes but was willing to try. Bryn flicked one ear. Then she leaned briefly against his boot, the same gesture she used with Marin, the one that meant you are accepted in the particular language of foxes, and walked away. Something crossed Edrin's face. It was brief and entirely unguarded, and she was quite sure he didn't know it had happened. But Marin saw it, because she was very good at seeing small things, and what she saw was a man who had just been, for possibly the first time in a very long time, accepted without condition. He cleared his throat. "What do you need to know about the Thornwood to understand what's happening to it?" "I need to see it," Marin said. "That would require entering Holt territory." "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "Then come." "Not today," she said, which surprised him. She could see that. "I have 2 animals to check before evening and a wren who is not ready to be left. Tomorrow." "Tomorrow," he agreed. She nodded and moved toward the stone enclosure where Birch was waiting, and behind her she heard Edin exhale, a long, slow breath, the kind that came after something had been settled. It was not until she was halfway across the garden that she realized she was smiling. She could not immediately explain why, except that something about being asked, not assigned, not overlooked, not tolerated, was a thing she had not experienced enough times to feel ordinary about it. She filed the smile away quickly, in the place where she kept things she needed to examine later when she was alone. Edin stayed another hour, mostly in silence, sitting on the low stone wall while she worked and occasionally asking questions about the salves on her window ledge, about the deer, about the crow's feather on the shelf inside that he had noticed yesterday. Good questions. Specific ones. The questions of someone paying attention, not filling space. She answered them, and he listened, and the morning settled around them like something that had been waiting to happen. It was Oswin who arrived at 11:30, slightly out of breath, a folded note in one hand and the other holding a wrapped bundle that smelled emphatically of pastry. He glanced at Marin first, a quick, assessing look, the kind he gave when he had something to say that wasn't for Edrin's ears. Then he turned to the king. "There you are," he said with profound relief, addressing Edin. Then, as though only now registering where here was, "Oh, you're... yes, here." "The note, Oswin." "Right." He handed it over. "From the court steward. Something about the Thornwood survey report and..." He paused to read over Edrin's shoulder with cheerful shamelessness. the Eastern delegation arriving a day early, which I said was going to happen. For the record, I said that. You said the opposite of that. I said it was a possibility. Edin folded the note. He looked at Marin with an expression that was tired in a specific way. Not the tiredness of a body, but the tiredness of someone being pulled back into a life they hadn't chosen. I have to return. I know. He held her gaze for a moment. Tomorrow, the Thornwood. I'll send Oswin at first light to meet you at the borderline. Oswin looked at the wrapped pastry in his hand, looked at the borderline, appeared to calculate the journey, and began eating the pastry immediately as a form of fortification. First light, Marin agreed. Edin turned to go. He had reached the gate when she spoke again, because something in her, the part that had lived very quietly for very long, decided it was time to stop practicing restraint on small things. Edin. He turned. The land didn't lose its keeper because the line broke, she said. It lost its keeper because no one looked in the right places. He stood at the gate of her small, honest cottage, with the rowan tree above him and the foxes watching from the hedge, and something in his face opened, just slightly, just at the edges, like a window that had been painted shut for years and had finally been persuaded to move. He did not say anything. He didn't need to. He closed the gate behind him with the care of someone who intended to open it again, and Marin watched him go, and the thread in her chest pulled taut and warm and steady, and the rowan tree dropped a single red berry onto the path at her feet, which was, in the language she had spent a lifetime learning, a very clear thing to say. This is the beginning. The borderline between Ashfin and the Holt territory was marked by nothing more dramatic than a change in the trees. On Marin's side, the woods were old but approachable, ash and rowan and silver birch, trees that leaned toward light that let the morning in. On the Holt side, the trees were older still, and they did not lean. They stood the way very old things stood. Not threatening, but absolute, as though they had been here before the concept of leaving, and intended to remain long after it became irrelevant. Their bark was darker. Their roots broke the surface of the earth in long, arching ridges, like the backs of sleeping creatures. And the smell was different, deeper, earthier, with something underneath that Marin had no precise word for, except that it reminded her of the moment just before rain, when the air held its breath. She felt it the instant she crossed over. Not danger. Not the sharp instinct pull she felt when something in her woods was wrong. This was slower, more deliberate, a recognition moving upward from the soles of her boots through the ground, as though the earth itself was turning its head to look. You, it seemed to say, in the particular language of very old places. Finally. Marin stopped walking. Oswin, who had been beside her explaining at length why first light was an unreasonable hour to ask anyone to be functional, walked 2 steps ahead before noticing she had stopped and turning back. He looked at her face. He stopped explaining. Are you all right? Yes. She pressed one hand briefly against the nearest trunk, a great dark oak whose bark was ridged and warm despite the morning chill. The recognition moved through her palm like a current, steady and certain. Give me a moment. Oswin gave her the moment with the respect of a man who had, she suspected, seen enough strange things in his years beside Edin Holt to know when something real was happening. When she lifted her hand from the bark, there was a faint luminescence on her palm, pale gold, barely visible in the morning light, like the afterglow of something briefly bright. It faded within seconds. But she felt it leave, and she felt what it left behind. A thread, new and clean, running from somewhere deep in her chest outward in every direction, connecting her to the root-dark, breathing world of the Thornwood. This is what I am, she thought, for the first time without grief. This is what I have always been. She walked on. Edin was waiting at the edge of the Thornwood's inner ring, where the oldest trees grew so close together their canopies had merged into a single unbroken ceiling of branches. He was looking up when she arrived, his expression carrying the particular mix of worry and helplessness that people wore when something they loved was suffering and they couldn't find the cause. She could see what his forester had meant, immediately and without question. The trees were not dead, but they were absent. The way a face could be present but the person behind it withdrawn, gone somewhere interior and unreachable. The bark was dry where it should have been damp. The moss at the roots was gray where it should have been green. And the smell, that deep, earthy, pre-rain smell she'd felt at the borderline, faded here into something flat, like a room where the windows had been closed too long. "You feel it," Edin said, watching her face. "Yes." She walked slowly into the inner ring, trailing her fingers along the nearest trunk. Nothing came back. No current, no recognition, just silence. How long has it been like this? The foresters first noticed it 3 months ago, but when I think back, when I'm honest about it, I think it began longer ago than that. Perhaps a year, perhaps 2. He followed her, keeping enough distance to let her work, but close enough that she was always aware of him. "I stopped coming here. After my wife passed, I told myself it was grief. I think now it may have been something else." "The land feels its keeper's absence," Marin said. "If the keeper withdraws, the land withdraws too." She turned to look at him. He was watching her with that expression, the recalibrating one, but deeper now, weighted with something she recognized as guilt. "This is not your fault," she said. "Grief is real. So is the kind of marriage that leaves you more alone than if you had never entered it." He was very still. "Your mother told you about the root call," she continued, moving again, touching another trunk, feeling for the current. "Did she tell you what a keeper needs to do?" "She said the keeper had to choose the land." His voice was quiet. "Not be assigned to it, not inherit it. Choose it." "Yes. And if the land chooses back, the Thornwood will remember itself," Marin finished. "Over time, with tending." She had reached the center of the inner ring, where the oldest tree stood, enormous, its trunk wider than 3 people standing with arms outstretched, its roots making a natural hollow at its base large enough to sit in. She stood before it and placed both palms flat against the bark and closed her eyes. The silence was profound. And then, faint, very faint, like a voice from the bottom of a well, she felt it. Not gone, not dead, sleeping, waiting. She breathed out slowly. "It's here," she said. "All of it. It hasn't left. It's been waiting." She opened her eyes and turned to find Edin standing much closer than he had been, drawn forward without realizing it, his face open in a way she was beginning to understand was rare for him. "It will come back, but it needs time, and it needs—" She hesitated. "What?" "It needs me to come back, regularly, to tend it." She lowered her hands. "That means entering Holt territory, more than once. As often as you like," Edin said, with a speed that suggested he had not fully planned the sentence before it left him. The ghost of a smile crossed Marin's mouth. She turned back to the great tree before he could see it properly. Behind them, from the direction of the tree line, came the sound of something moving through the undergrowth with enthusiasm and very little grace, followed by Oswin's voice saying, "I specifically said stay on the path," followed by a series of small, ecstatic howls. The pups had escaped. All 4 of them burst into the inner ring in a cascade of white fur and flying leaves, Cinder in the lead with his dignified expression, Fletch barking at a pine cone as though it had personally offended him, Moat carrying something large and entirely unidentified, and Rook arriving last, yawning, apparently having napped the entire journey and only now rejoining events. They reached Marin and broke like a small white wave around her feet, tails going, noses working, and the great tree above them, the sleeping, waiting, silent tree did something that made both Marin and Edin go very still. It moved, not dramatically, not with any sound, but the bark shifted subtly in the way of something breathing, and from one of its great root hollows a single green shoot pushed up through the gray moss, small and bright and utterly impossible for early October. Oswin appeared at the tree line, out of breath, and took in the scene. The shoot, the pups, the two people standing in the center of the inner ring, not looking at the tree anymore, but at each other, with the expression of two people standing at the edge of something large that neither of them had names for yet. Right, Oswin said softly to himself. So that's how it is. He sat down on a root, pulled a somewhat flattened pastry from his coat pocket, and very quietly ate it. Rook padded over and sat beside him. Oswin broke off a piece without being asked. You and me both, Oswin told him under his breath. Rook wagged once, with great feeling. The shoot at the base of the great tree caught the morning light and held it, small and green and certain, in the gray heart of the sleeping Thornwood. The walk back from the Thornwood took longer than the walk in. Not because the path was difficult. Edin knew these woods the way Marin knew her own, with the bone-deep familiarity of a lifetime of footsteps, but because they were talking, and talking slowed the feet in the way that only certain conversations did. The kind where stopping felt like losing something. Marin had not had many of those conversations in her life. She recognized this one by the way she kept forgetting to watch the path. Tell me about the court, she said, as they walked the long straight line of beeches that marked the inner road toward the Holt Estate's outer grounds. Edin was quiet for a moment, not the withholding kind of quiet, but the sorting kind. It is a place, he said eventually, that has spent many years being run by the loudest person in any room. My wife was very capable, and very certain of herself, and not particularly interested in what happened to the people at the bottom of things. The poor, the tenants, the workers in the outer villages, the Omegas. He said the last word with a deliberateness that told her it was not accidental. She felt the function of the court was to maintain the power of the court. Everything else was secondary. And you? I disagreed. Flat, simple, carrying about 20 years of compressed frustration in 3 syllables. I disagreed frequently and loudly, and it changed very little, because the structure of things, the way power flowed, the advisors she had cultivated, the expectations of the inner circle, was not set up to accommodate a king who wanted to redirect funds from ceremonial building projects to village infrastructure. They called you weak, Marin said. He looked at her sidelong. Yes. Were you? The question landed without cruelty. She asked it the way she asked animals why they were limping, directly and without judgment, because the answer mattered more than the feeling around it. He seemed to understand this because he considered it genuinely. I was, he said, a man who believed that if he waited long enough, circumstances would change. That is not strength. That is patience, dressed up as virtue. A pause. I have been trying to understand the difference for several years now. And? The difference is whether you are waiting for something or waiting instead of doing something. Marin thought about this. She thought about 50 years of walking past whispers with her chin up and her eyes forward, and about whether that had been dignity or avoidance, and about how sometimes those two things lived so close together it took a very long time to tell them apart. I understand that, she said. He looked at her with the expression that was becoming familiar, the one where he registered something she'd said and filed it in a place he intended to return to. They emerged from the beeches onto a wide grassy slope that ran down toward the outer grounds of the Holt estate, and Marin stopped walking. She had never seen it from this angle. From the borderlands, the estate was a distant shape above the tree line, towers and roof lines suggesting a structure without revealing it. From here, up close, it was large. That was the honest word. large and gray and built for permanence, the kind of architecture that said we intend to remain in every stone. But it was also, she thought, not entirely without beauty. The eastern tower had ivy up to its third window. The outer wall had a garden running along its base that someone had once planted with care, and that now maintained itself in cheerful, slightly overgrown abundance. "It's not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "Something more severe." "It wants to be less severe than it is," Edin said, with such matter-of-fact sadness that she turned to look at him. "The garden along the east wall, that was my mother's. She planted it. No one has tended it properly since she passed, but it refuses to die, which I have always found." He stopped. "Hopeful," Marin said. "Yes." They stood looking at it together, and Marin thought about roots. About things that survived neglect not because they didn't feel it, but because they were made for something deeper than neglect could reach. The sound of raised voices drifted from the direction of the main gate, not angry exactly, but sharp-edged, the kind of voices that were performing for an audience. One voice in particular rose above the others, precise and carrying, each word placed with the deliberateness of someone who had learned very early that volume was a tool. Edrin's expression changed. It was subtle, just a slight setting of the jaw, a small withdrawal behind the eyes. But Marin had become fluent and subtle. "Eloise," she said. "She arrived this morning, early." He began walking again toward the gate, and Marin fell into step beside him. "She does that when she wants to establish something before I've had time to prepare." "What does she want to establish today?" "That the Pups' training schedule should begin immediately. That the eldest, Cinder, should be formally presented to the court as heir candidate before the winter assembly." A pause. "That I am moving too slowly." "And are you?" He stopped walking, looked at her with an expression that was, for just a moment, entirely unguarded, tired and honest, and carrying something that wanted very badly to be said. "I am moving," he said carefully, "in a direction she didn't plan for, which she will interpret as the same thing." Before Marin could answer, the gate opened and Eloise Holt walked through it. She was striking. Marin would have said that even without kindness, because it was simply true. Tall, like her father, with the same strong-boned face, but where Edrin's features had softened with age and something that might have been wisdom, hers were arranged in the precise and deliberate way of someone who had decided, young, exactly what impression they intended to make, and had been making it ever since. Her hair was dark and perfectly arranged. Her posture was the posture of someone who had never, in her adult life, entered a room that she didn't immediately reclassify as hers. She looked at Edin, then she looked at Marin. The assessment was instantaneous and complete. Marin could track it the way she tracked the calculations of wary animals. Age, status, clothing, relationship to her father, threat level. It was the last part that surprised her. Not the assessment itself, but the result of it. Something flickering behind Eloise's composed expression that was not dismissal. It was recognition. Not "I know you." Something older and less comfortable than that. Something that said "I know what you are," in the way that people with a great deal of something sometimes recognized, in others, the specific absence of the thing they feared losing. "Father," Eloise said, her voice smooth and warm and carrying about 40% more warmth than Marin suspected was natural. "I was beginning to wonder where you had gone." "The Thornwood," Edin said. "Marin, this is my daughter, Eloise. Marin tends the borderland woods. She has some knowledge of the root call that I thought might be useful." "The root call." Eloise repeated it with the particular tone of someone filing information away behind a pleasant face. "How interesting." She turned the full weight of her attention on Marin, and Marin met it without stepping back. "We must speak more about that. I have always been fascinated by the old ways." She had not, Marin thought, been fascinated by anything in her life that she could not also use. "Of course," Marin said pleasantly. Something shifted in Eloise's expression. The faintest recalculation. There and gone. She had expected, Marin understood, a different kind of Omega. The kind who looked at the ground. "Wonderful," Eloise said, and smiled. It was a very good smile, the kind that required practice. Behind them, from the direction of the stables, came the sound of Oswin arriving with the pups. Moat still in possession of his unidentified object, Fletch already attempting to challenge the estate's stone gateposts, Cinder walking with his careful dignity, and Rook occupying Oswin's arms entirely, apparently having decided that walking was optional. "I have them," Oswin announced. "Mostly." Cinder walked directly to Marin and sat on her foot. In the small, charged silence that followed, with Eloise's eyes moving between her father and the old Omega woman her father had brought to the gates of the Holt estate, Marin looked down at the white pup on her boot and felt the thread in her chest pull taut and warm and certain. She was beginning to understand that this warmth was not going to be a small thing, and from the look on Eloise Holt's face, composed, pleasant, and absolutely alert, she was not the only one who had understood that. The East Garden was lovelier up close than it had been from the slope. Marin discovered this on her third visit to the Holt estate, when Edin led her along the outer wall to show her what his mother had planted and what had survived it. Lavender gone woody with age but still flowering, a climbing rose that had abandoned its original trellis entirely and was now making its own arrangements with the stonework, and at the far end, a stand of old hawthorn whose roots had cracked the garden path in 3 places and showed absolutely no remorse about it. "It's been doing that since I was a child," Edin said, looking at the cracked path with an expression of fond exasperation. "The groundskeeper tried to remove it twice. Both times it came back." "Of course it did," Marin said. "Hawthorn doesn't negotiate." She crouched beside the largest root crack and pressed her fingers into the earth there, feeling for the Thornwood's thread. It was stronger now than it had been a week ago. The green shoot at the great tree's base had grown 3 inches since her first visit, which was not possible in October by any natural measure, and the moss along the inner ring had begun to recover its color. She came every morning, staying 2 hours, walking the roots and the hollows, and speaking to the trees in the way she spoke to all living things. Not with words exactly, but with attention. With the specific quality of presence that said, "I see you, and I am not leaving." The thread hummed under her fingers. "It's spreading," she said. "The recovery. It's moving outward from the inner ring." Edin crouched beside her. He did that now, without ceremony, folded his considerable height down to her level as though it were the obvious thing to do. "How far?" "By spring, if it continues at this rate, most of the inner territory." She sat back on her heels. "The outer rings will take longer, a year, maybe 2. You'll need to come regularly, for 2 years. "Yes?" "That seems," he said carefully, "like a reason to make things more convenient." She looked at him. He was looking at the hawthorn root, which was, she suspected, deliberate. "There is a cottage on the eastern edge of the estate grounds. It's been empty for 6 years. It's smaller than... well, it's not small, actually. It's quite a decent size. It has a garden that has gone entirely to its own devices, which I think you might consider a feature rather than a problem. And it is considerably closer to the Thornwood than Ashfin is." The morning light came through the climbing rose and laid a pattern of shadows on the path between them. "You're asking me to move," Marin said. "I'm making an observation about geography and infrastructure," Edin said, with great focus on the hawthorn, "and leaving the interpretation entirely to you." Marin was quiet for a moment. Inside her chest, the thread, the root call, the Thornwood's thread, and the other one, the older one, the one she had no name for, pulled gently and warm, the way it always did when she was in this man's company. She was 77 years old, and she had lived alone for 50 years, and she knew, with the clarity that came from a long life of paying attention, that she was being offered something she had never been offered before. Not a grand gesture, not a dramatic declaration, just a cottage near the woods, offered by a man who watched hawthorn roots with fond exasperation and asked foxes how they were, and had, 3 days ago, spent 40 minutes sitting on a garden wall while she treated a badger's infected paw without once suggesting he had anywhere more important to be. "I'll look at it," she said. He looked at her then, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had yet seen. Something that had been held carefully for a very long time, briefly released. "Good," he said. Simply. As though that was all it needed to be. It was Moat who interrupted them, emerging from beneath the hawthorn with a stone in his mouth, large, smooth, clearly selected with great intention, which he dropped at Marin's feet and then looked at her with an expression of enormous personal satisfaction. "That's a gift," Marin said, picking it up. "He's been doing that all week," Edin said. "Following your example, I think. He watched you with the lavender. He's been paying attention. They all have." He looked at the 4 pups, Cinder now investigating the rose trellis with architectural interest, Fletch attempting to stare down a sparrow perched on the wall above him, Rook asleep in a patch of sun with the unhurried serenity of someone who had found the single best spot in any location and claimed it. "They're different here. With you." "They're relaxed," Marin said. "There's a difference between relaxed and different. In this court," Edin said quietly. "Those two things have not historically been available at the same time." She heard what was underneath that, all the years of it, the weight. And she did not try to lift it for him, because she had learned that some things needed to be carried consciously before they could be set down. She simply let it be heard, which was sometimes the more useful thing. They were walking back toward the main courtyard when Oswin appeared at the inner gate, with the expression of a man delivering news he had arranged his face for. "Lady Eloise," Oswin said, "has called a gathering of the inner council for this afternoon. She has also, and I want to note that I am simply reporting and not editorially commenting, invited 3 families from the Northern Territories whose eldest sons are of mating age." A silence. "For what purpose?" Edin said, in a tone that was very flat and very even. "She has," Oswin continued, clearly having rehearsed this, "expressed the view that the Holt bloodline requires strengthening through strategic alliance, and that the Pups' eventual place in the succession would be considerably more secure if the family's position were consolidated." He paused. "I am now editorially commenting. She means herself. The consolidation is for herself." Marin said nothing. She turned the smooth stone Moat had given her over in her fingers and watched Edrin's face move through several things in the space of a breath. Anger, weariness, and something older than either, the specific exhaustion of a person who had been here before and knew exactly where the path led. "She wants to choose the pups' futures before they're old enough to choose anything," he said. "Yes," Oswin said. "That is the editorial summary. She cannot force a formal succession claim without my seal." "She is aware of this. She is also," Oswin said carefully, "bringing 3 families who will publicly witness whatever she proposes this afternoon, which makes refusing it considerably more complicated than refusing it in private." Marin looked at Edin. He was very still. Not the calm kind of stillness, but the kind that came just before something that had been compressed for a long time made a decision about direction. "Then I will be there," he said. "I thought you might say that." Oswin produced from his coat a folded document. "I have taken the liberty of preparing a counter-proposal regarding the Eastern Village Infrastructure Fund, which has been waiting for your seal for 4 months, and which, if signed today publicly, in front of the same witnesses, would make a rather clear statement about where the court's priorities currently reside." Edin looked at the document. Then at Oswin, with an expression that contained genuine warmth. "When did you prepare this?" "Last night? I had a feeling. Oswin smoothed the document with the dignity of a man who had done something quietly useful and intended to receive no particular credit for it. Also, Rook sat on my feet for an hour while I wrote it, so technically it is a collaborative effort. Rook, from his sunny patch by the wall, thumped his tail without opening his eyes. Marin made a sound. She quickly turned into a cough. I need an hour, Edin told her. The council meeting is at 3. He paused. You don't have to stay. I know. She looked at him steadily. I'll look at the cottage while you meet. Something settled in his expression, relief, and the particular quality of a man realizing he is not, for once, facing something entirely alone. She turned toward the eastern grounds, stone still in her hand, and behind her she heard Oswin say quietly to Edin, I like her very much. And Edrin's response, quieter still, which she was almost certain she was not meant to hear, so do I. Her step did not falter, but the thread in her chest went warm and bright, and she pressed her thumb against the smooth stone, and somewhere in the Thornwood the great tree's roots shifted gently in the earth. The cottage was exactly as described. It was stone like her own, but larger. 2 real rooms and a third that had been a workroom and smelled still of dried herbs, which she chose to interpret as deliberate. The garden had indeed gone entirely to its own devices, and its devices were magnificent. Self-seated foxgloves along the south wall, a fig tree that had outgrown its original corner and was conducting a slow, cheerful annexation of the eastern fence, and at the very center, a well with a hand pump that worked, which she tested twice because she believed in testing important things. She stood in the middle of the overgrown garden and felt the Thornwood thread hum beneath her feet. Closer here, stronger, more present than it was even in her own cottage at the borderline edge. This is where you're supposed to be, the earth said, in its patient, root-deep language. She had been waiting 77 years for the world to say something like that to her. She looked at the fig tree. She looked at the foxgloves. She looked at the workroom with its ghost of dried herbs. All right, she said, to all of it, and none of it specifically. She was still standing there, working something out inside herself, when she heard the sharp sound of raised voices from the direction of the main hall. Eloise's voice, precise and carrying, and beneath it the lower register of Edrin's, steady in the way of something that had made up its mind. And beneath that, barely audible, the sound of 4 small wolves beginning to howl, confused, distressed, searching for the particular frequency that meant safe. Marin was moving back toward the hall before she had consciously decided to. She did not go inside. She stopped at the threshold of the main hall's outer corridor, because she was not a member of this court, and she had not been invited into this meeting, and she was clear-eyed about this, an Omega from a border village who had known this man for less than 3 weeks. She did not belong in the middle of a formal council gathering, and she knew it. And she stood in the corridor and she breathed, and she listened to the pups. They were in the antechamber off the main hall. She could hear them through the closed door, the 4 distinct voices she had already learned to tell apart. Cinder's low, unhappy rumble, Fletch's sharp, repeated yips, Moat's thin, wavering sound that was not quite a howl and not quite a whimper, and Rook, even Rook, awake, turning in anxious circles if she had to guess by the pattern of his sound. She opened the antechamber door. 4 white heads turned toward her simultaneously. The relief in the room was immediate and physical. 4 bodies moving toward her at once, a small avalanche of warm fur and cold noses and tails going in every direction. She sat down on the stone floor without ceremony, because that was what was needed, and let them climb over her, and spoke to them in the low, steady voice she used for frightened animals, and gradually, one by one, they settled. Cinder pressed his head under her hand. Fletch curled against her knee. Moat sat on her foot. He had learned this from Cinder and appeared to consider it a high honor. And Rook arranged himself across her lap with the totality of someone who had found his designated location. I know, she said quietly. I know. It's all right. Through the wall, she could hear the council meeting in progress. Not words, just tone and rhythm. The particular cadence of a room in which several people were trying to be the loudest reasonable voice. Eloise's register cut through the others the way a sharp knife cut through softer things. Not loud, exactly, but precise. Designed to land. She had sat here for perhaps 20 minutes when the door between the antechamber and the main hall opened. Not Edin, not Oswin. Eloise stepped through and closed the door behind her with perfect quietness, the way people did when they had left a room strategically rather than actually. She looked at Marin on the floor with 4 wolf pups arranged around her, and her expression did what Marin had noticed it doing at the gate. That flicker, there and gone, the one that was not quite dismissal, and not quite what it pretended to be. They trust you, Eloise said. Not warmly. Observationally, the way a person catalogued a piece of information. They were anxious, Marin said. They're calm now. Eloise crossed the room and sat, not on the floor, on the small bench by the window, with the grace of someone who had never in her life sat anywhere that was not the right kind of sitting. She looked at her sons. Something moved in her face, briefly, that was more complicated than strategy. She did love them, Marin thought. That was real. The problem was that Eloise's love had the same shape as everything else she did. Purposeful, directed, attached to a future she had already planned. She loved the pups the way she loved her own position, fiercely, and on the condition that they remained what she needed them to be. You've been coming here often, Eloise said. The Thornwood needed attention. The Thornwood, Eloise said, with the tone of someone repeating a word to examine it from all sides, has been declining for 2 years. Curious that the solution arrived at the same time as you. Solutions often arrive when someone looks for them, Marin said. My father is looking for a great many things lately. Eloise's eyes moved to Marin's face with the precision of a woman who had learned that the most useful information was the kind that people didn't realize they were giving. He seems lighter since you started coming. That's between him and himself. It's between him and the court, Eloise said, whether he chooses to acknowledge it or not. My father is the Holt Alpha. Everything about him is, in some respect, the court's concern. She paused, including the company he keeps. The words were measured, not threatening, too careful for that, and too intelligent. More like a door being outlined, its frame made visible so that everyone in the room knew it was there before anyone decided whether to open it. Marin looked at her steadily. Then the court should perhaps direct its concern toward the eastern villages, where 3 of the outer tenants have been waiting 14 months for a structural repair allocation that has been redirected 4 times. A silence. You've been reading the estate records, Eloise said. Oswin is forthcoming when asked the right questions. Something shifted in Eloise's expression. The recalibration Marin was learning to recognize in the Holt family, but faster in Eloise, sharper, and with a different quality underneath. Not admiration, reassessment. You're not what I expected, Eloise said. No one ever is, Marin said, when they haven't been looking properly. Cinder lifted his head from Marin's hand and looked at his mother with the patient, heavy gaze of a pup who was older in his soul than his body suggested. Eloise looked back at him with an expression that was, for just a moment, entirely unguarded. And what Marin saw there was not a Circe, not a strategist, but a woman who was genuinely afraid. Not of losing power, though that was also true. Afraid, at the level where people did not choose their feelings, of being irrelevant. Of watching her sons grow toward someone else's warmth and find it sufficient. It was, Marin thought, a real fear, and a real wound. And it would make Eloise significantly more dangerous, not less, because real wounds drove people to do real things. The door to the main hall opened again, and Edin stepped through. And the expression on his face when he found Marin on the floor with the pups, found her still here, having stayed, having managed, was something she felt in the hollow beneath her sternum, like a hand pressing gently on a bruise she had not known was there. He looked at Eloise. Something passed between them in the wordless language of people who had loved each other imperfectly for a long time. "The proposal has been tabled," he said, "until the winter assembly." "Of course," Eloise said, and smiled her practiced smile, and stood and crossed to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. "Miss Ashgrove." Marin met her eyes. "I hope you will join us for dinner," Eloise said. "I find I have quite a few questions about the root call." She left before Marin could answer, the door clicking softly behind her. The room was quiet. Rook, still sprawled across Marin's lap, sneezed once and went back to sleep, because he had assessed the situation and found it adequately resolved. Oswin appeared in the doorway, slightly pink, holding the signed infrastructure document with both hands like an offering. "It's done," he said. He signed it, in front of everyone. He looked at Edin with the expression of a man who had been waiting for this specific moment for approximately 4 years. "I may need a moment." "Take your moment, Oswin." "Thank you." He pressed the document to his chest briefly, composed himself, and then looked at Marin on the floor surrounded by pups with the warmth of someone witnessing something they had quietly hoped for. "The cottage on the east grounds," he said, "has a very good pump. I tested it myself. Twice." "So did I," Marin said. Oswin nodded, satisfied, as though this settled something. He withdrew, document in hand, with the quiet dignity of a man whose work was done. Edin sat down beside Marin on the floor, not in a chair, not on the bench, but on the floor, his back against the wall, Cinder immediately relocating to press against his side. He looked tired, the kind of tired that went past the body. "She'll try again," he said. "Yes. At the winter assembly with more preparation and better timing." "Yes." He turned to look at her. "You're not going to tell me it will be fine." "No," Marin said, "but I'll tell you it will be faced, which is different." He held her gaze for a long moment. In the shifting afternoon light, with the pups settled between and around them, with the sound of the old estate breathing in its stones, something between them, that unnamed thread, that thing with no word yet, grew 1 degree warmer and 1 degree less possible to pretend was not there. "Marin," he said very quietly. "Not yet," she said, just as quietly. "But soon." He was still for a moment, then slowly, something in his face let go. Not resolved, not fixed, but held differently. The way you held something when you knew you were not holding it alone. The evening light found them there, 2 old people and 4 white wolves on a cold stone floor, and it was, without question or caveat, enough. The great hall of the Holt estate had been built for exactly this kind of occasion. Marin could feel it in the stones. The way the ceiling drew sound upward and held it. The way the long windows funneled the winter light into deliberate columns that fell on the floor like appointments. Every surface was designed to make certain people feel small and others feel inevitable. She had spent enough years being made to feel small to recognize the architecture of it. She stood near the eastern wall, at the edge of the gathered crowd, and she breathed. She was not a member of this court. She had not been invited as a dignitary, or a Luna, or anything with a title attached. She had come because Edin had asked her, quietly, at the door of the East Cottage 3 mornings ago, standing in the fig tree's long shadow, and because she had learned over the past 2 months that when this man asked her something it mattered. The East Cottage was hers now. Had been hers for 6 weeks, and in 6 weeks she had filled it with dried herbs and river stones and the particular organized chaos of a life that had finally been given enough room. The Thornwood thread hummed under her feet every morning. The foxes had followed her from Ashfin without being asked. Birch the deer had made the journey in stages, arriving at the new garden gate one morning with the air of someone who had always planned to do this and had simply been waiting for the right moment. Moat had helped him find the gate, which no one could entirely explain. She was thinking about this, about Moat and the deer and the inexplicable competence of small creatures. When the assembly formally opened and Eloise walked to the center of the hall, and the room rearranged itself around her the way rooms did when a person had spent a lifetime learning to command them. She was magnificent, and Marin acknowledged this without resentment, the way she acknowledged weather. Eloise wore deep burgundy, her dark hair pinned with precision, and she moved to the speaking floor with the ease of someone who had been rehearsing this specific walk in her mind for months. The 3 northern families she had invited were arranged in the front rows. Marin had learned their names from Oswin, who had provided a full briefing the previous evening over tea, complete with editorial commentary and a hand-drawn seating diagram that was surprisingly accurate. "Lords and allies of the Holt Court," Eloise began, her voice finding the ceiling perfectly, "we gather at the Winter Assembly to speak of continuity, of what we build and what we leave behind, of the futures we choose for those who come after us." Beside Marin, a quiet, familiar step. Edin took his place at her side. Not at the front of the room where his position technically required him to be. Not yet, but here, at the edge, for just a moment. His shoulder an inch from hers, the warmth of him present in the winter-cold hall. "She's better at this than she used to be," he said, very low. "She's been planning this for longer than she's admitting." "Yes." A pause. "The northern family's eldest sons, the one on the left has already been told that Cinder would be presented today as heir candidate, pending a formal approval I have not given." "I know. Oswin told me." He turned to look at her. "Oswin tells you everything." "Oswin," Marin said, "is a man who has been waiting for someone to listen to him properly for about 30 years. A breath that was almost a laugh moved through Edin, quiet and warm, and she felt it in her shoulder where it nearly touched his. In the center of the hall, Eloise had moved to the next movement of her prepared address. The pups. They were brought in by the court attendant, all 4, and the room made the sound rooms made for beautiful things. Because they were beautiful. White as the snow outside the long windows, their coats fully grown now into the thick winter fur that made them look like small, regal, slightly ridiculous clouds. Cinder walked in with his careful dignity. Fletch immediately looked for something to challenge. Moat had a dried fig in his mouth. From the East Cottage garden, Marin knew, because she had watched him take it that morning and had decided that confiscating it would start a negotiation she did not have time for. Rook was asleep in the attendant's arms. The attendant had given up on the concept of Rook approximately 1 month ago. Everyone had. "These 4, Eloise said, her voice full of a warmth that was real and also carefully positioned, "are the future of the Holt bloodline. The eldest," and here her gaze moved to Cinder, "is ready to be formally recognized, to have his place in the succession named and sealed." The room stirred. The northern families leaned forward. The inner council exchanged glances of the practiced, non-committal kind. And Cinder, in the center of the hall, turned his silver eyes away from his mother. He looked at Marin. Across the length of the great hall, through the assembled court of the Holt kingdom, past the winter light and the long columns of deliberate stone. The pup found her at the eastern wall and held her gaze with the steady, unhurried certainty of an animal who knew exactly where safe was. The room noticed. Rooms always noticed when something changed that they hadn't been told to notice. Eloise noticed most of all. Her composure did not break. It was too well built for that. But Marin saw the seam of it, the slight tightening around her eyes, the moment of recalculation. "The recognition of an heir," Edin said, stepping forward from the eastern wall, his voice carrying the hall without apparent effort, "requires the Alpha's seal, which has not been given." Every head turned. The room reconfigured around him the way it had around Eloise, but differently. Less performance, more gravity, The kind of authority that came not from preparation, but from something decided. The question of succession, he continued, moving to the center of the floor, is not a question for this assembly. It is a question for time, and for the pups themselves, when they are of age to choose. He paused and looked at the northern families with a directness that was entirely without hostility and entirely without deference. I thank you for coming. The Holt Court values its alliances in the north. Those alliances do not require the future of 4 young wolves to be signed away before they are old enough to have a preference about it. The silence in the hall was the absolute kind, the kind that meant everyone was waiting to see what the next thing would be. Eloise's expression was perfectly arranged. Father, she said, with the warmth of a daughter and the precision of an opponent, no one is signing anything away. I am simply asking for what is traditional, for what the bloodline requires. The bloodline, Edin said, requires wisdom more than it requires speed. He turned then. And this was the part that Marin had not expected, because she had not prepared herself for it, had not built any defenses against it. He turned and looked directly at her, not with the look of a man referencing an ally, not with the look of a king acknowledging a useful resource, with the look of a man showing the room what mattered to him. The Holt territory has a root call keeper for the first time in a generation, he said, his voice steady and clear and entirely public. Marin Ashgrove has been tending the Thornwood for 2 months. The inner ring has recovered. The old trees are alive again in ways my foresters cannot explain by any natural measure. A pause, weighted and deliberate. She is also, he said, the clearest-minded person I have encountered in 80 years of living, and I am not inclined to keep that opinion to myself any longer. The room made a sound. Eloise made no sound. Her face was a study in a woman receiving information she had already partially prepared for, and finding that preparation insufficient. Marin stood at the eastern wall and felt the whole room's attention turned to her, and she did what she had always done. She did not look at the floor. She had spent 77 years being made to feel that looking up was a presumption. She was done with that particular accommodation. She looked back. Cinder walked across the hall, past the northern families, past the inner council, past his mother, and sat on Marin's boot. Fletch followed, then Moat, and last of all the attendant carrying Rook, who was awake now, blinking around at the assembled court of the Holt Kingdom with the unbothered expression of someone who had already known how this was going to go. Oswin, from his place near the back wall, pressed his lips together very hard. He had the look of a man composing a memory. Miss Ashgrove, Eloise said across the hall, in her careful, precise voice, you seem to have made quite a home here. The challenge was real. The room heard it. Marin heard it. She looked at Eloise. At the real woman underneath the performance, the one who was afraid, the one who loved her sons in her complicated, gripping way, and she chose her words with the same care she used for frightened animals. No cruelty. No performance. Just plain truth, offered quietly. I have, Marin said, and I intend to take care of it. The meaning carried in both directions, and Eloise heard both, and something in her face, just for a moment, just at the edges, shifted from opposition into something more complicated, something that might, given time and different circumstances, become respect. Edin crossed the hall and stood beside Marin, and the room held its breath. The assembly is adjourned, he said. We will speak of succession at the appropriate time. For now, the Eastern Village's infrastructure allocation will be implemented before the new year. He looked at the inner council. This is not a discussion. Oswin, from the back wall, exhaled so slowly and so completely that it was nearly audible. Rook licked Marin's wrist once, thumped his tail, and closed his eyes. The winter light held everything in its long, deliberate columns, and the hall breathed around the 2 old people standing at its center, not performing, not positioned, just present, and the Thornwood thread hummed warm and certain under the stone floor, running all the way from the great tree's roots to the place where Marin stood. "This is yours," it said. "You chose it, and it chose you back." She did not say this out loud. She did not need to. 1 year later. Spring. The Thornwood was unrecognizable, not in the way of things that had been changed against their nature, but in the way of things that had been returned to it. The moss along the inner ring was so deeply, extravagantly green that it seemed lit from within. The great tree at the center had put out 3 new branches over the winter, each one reaching outward with the unhurried confidence of something that had decided it had time. The old root hollow at its base, where Marin pressed her palms each morning, was warm to the touch now regardless of the season, and from it ran a faint thread of gold that was visible only at dawn, tracing the root lines outward through the earth like a map of something alive and certain. The foresters had stopped trying to explain it. Oswin had written it down in a very long document that he had titled, with characteristic precision, "On the Recovery of the Holt Thornwood and Related Matters of Significant Personal Interest." He had read portions of it aloud to Rook, who had listened with his eyes closed and his tail moving in a slow, appreciative rhythm. Marin came to the Thornwood every morning. She had not missed a single one. She stood now at the great tree's base in the early spring light, her palms flat against the warm bark, and she let the thread run through her the way it always did, grounding her, filling the hollow places, reminding her of what she was. Not the woman the village had forgotten. Not the Omega no one had chosen. The keeper. The one the land had been waiting for, with the patience of something that measured time in centuries and had never once doubted she would arrive. She was 78 years old. She had never, in all those years, felt more entirely herself. The sound of footsteps on the root path behind her was familiar before she turned. The particular cadence she had memorized without meaning to. The step of a man who had spent a year relearning how to walk without urgency. Edin stopped beside her and looked up at the great tree with the expression he always wore here. Something between reverence and gratitude. The expression of a man who understood that he had been given something he had not earned and was trying to be worthy of it anyway. "The eastern branch," he said, "grew another 6 inches overnight." "I know. I measured it this morning." "Of course you did." She looked at him sidelong, and he was already looking at her, and between them something warm and settled moved. The thread, the old thread, the one she had finally named. Not in words, in the way she had learned to name things that lived in her chest, by the quality of its warmth and the direction it ran, and what it did to the shape of a morning. It ran toward him. It always had. They had not rushed. That had been their agreement, unspoken and mutual. The agreement of 2 people who had both spent lifetimes in the wrong kind of hurry and had finally found something worth being slow with. There had been evenings by her fire, and mornings in the Thornwood, and long afternoons in the East Cottage garden where she worked and he read, and the comfortable quiet between them grew from something new and fragile into something solid and sure. There had been one evening, 3 months after the winter assembly, when the fig tree had dropped a branch in a wind, and he had stayed to help her clear it, and they had ended up sitting on the garden wall until the stars came out, and he had taken her hand, and she had let him, and neither of them had made a production of it because neither of them needed to. His hand around hers, the stars coming out over the Thornwood, the thread going warm and certain in her chest. That was enough. That was, she had thought, perhaps the most enough anything had ever been. They had been married in the East Garden on the first morning of the new year, with the Thornwood watching through the eastern fence, and Oswin weeping so thoroughly that he had needed 2 handkerchiefs and had borrowed a third from the head forester. The ceremony had been small, exactly as they had wanted, exactly as they had planned. No performance, no assembly. Just the 2 of them and the people who had earned their way into the space. Cinder had worn a small wreath of dried flowers that Moat had assembled from the garden and placed on his brother's head with such solemnity that no one had laughed. Not even Fletch, who had been stationed importantly at the garden gate and had taken the role so seriously that he had challenged and then escorted every arriving guest with the focused energy of someone who had finally found his true calling. Rook had slept through the ceremony. He had woken for the food and considered this an equitable arrangement. The court had accepted it with the range of responses that courts produced for things they had not planned. Surprise from the outer circles, quiet approval from those who had watched Edrin's face change over the past months, and from the inner council, the careful and slightly relieved acknowledgement of people who recognized stability when they finally saw it. Eloise had not attended. She had sent a letter instead, brief, precise in her careful hand. Marin had read it twice and then set it on the mantel because it deserved to be kept. It was not an apology. It was not a surrender. It was, she thought, the most honest thing Eloise had ever written. 4 sentences that said, between their careful lines, "I do not yet understand this, but I am watching, and I see that my sons are well." That was enough. That was, perhaps, the beginning of something that might, over years, with patience, grow into more. Marin had written back. 1 page, plain and direct, the way she did everything. She had said that the door of the East Cottage was always open, and that she had no interest in replacing anything that was irreplaceable, and that the pups were extraordinary, and Eloise should know that she could see them whenever she wished. The letter had gone unanswered for 6 weeks. And then one morning Eloise had arrived at the East Cottage gate, alone, without ceremony, without strategy visible on her face. And Marin had opened the gate, and they had sat in the garden with tea, and the conversation had been careful, and neither of them had pretended it was easy. And that was exactly right. It would take time. Real things did. In the Thornwood, the great tree shifted above them, and a single early blossom fell from the new eastern branch and landed in Marin's hair. Edin reached up and did not take it out. He adjusted it instead, gently, with the focused attention of someone doing something that mattered. She looked at him. "Luna," he said very quietly, with the particular gravity of a man using a word he had turned over in his hands for months before deciding it was the right one. She had not taken a title. The court had offered her several, and she had declined them all with the same pleasant firmness she used for everything she didn't need. But this one, this old word, this word that meant moon and she who the land answers to, he had offered not as a title but as a name, and it had settled into her like the root call thread, right and certain, and entirely hers. "You're going to be insufferably sentimental in the Thornwood every morning," she told him. "Yes," he agreed, without apology. The sound of 4 wolves at full sprint reached them approximately 3 seconds before the wolves themselves did. White shapes bursting through the root path entrance with the energy of animals who had decided that morning was an event requiring their full participation. Cinder arrived first, found his position at Marin's side, and stood with the quiet dignity of a wolf who was growing into something remarkable. Fletch arrived second, skidded on the moss, recovered with magnificent composure, and immediately found a tree to challenge. Moat arrived third, carrying, as was his custom, a small object of mysterious origin. This morning it appeared to be a button, large and brass, from a coat that Oswin had reported missing. And Rook arrived last, at a trot, completely unhurried, and walked directly to the sunniest patch of root and lay down in it with the serenity of a creature who had assessed the morning and found it adequate. Oswin appeared at the path entrance, breathing hard, holding a coat missing 1 brass button. He looked at Moat. He looked at his coat. He looked at Marin and Edin standing beneath the great flowering tree, Cinder at their feet and the spring light in the branches above them. And he took a slow breath in and let it out, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who had been loyal for 30 years and had finally arrived at the place that loyalty had been building toward. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning, Oswin," Marin said. "The kitchen has made the rosemary bread you like." And there's a message from the Eastern Village. The new well pump arrived yesterday, and they wanted you both to know. He paused. Also, Moat has my button. I know. I'd like it back. You'll need to negotiate with Moat. Oswin looked at Moat. Moat looked at Oswin with the patient, enormous-eyed expression of a wolf who was open to a conversation, but felt he held the stronger position. Oswin sat down on a root. What do you want for it? Moat set down the button, walked to Oswin, and placed one paw on his knee. Oswin looked at the paw. He looked at the button. He looked at the Thornwood full of spring and the great tree blooming above two people who had found each other at the very end of the lives they'd been handed and built something entirely new from the remaining time. He put his hand over the paw. Fair enough, he said. The Thornwood breathed. The great tree held its blossoms in the morning light. The eastern villages had clean water and repaired rooftops, and in the outer ring of the woods, the last gray patches of moss were turning green one by one, like small lights coming on in the dark. The kingdom was not fixed. Kingdoms never were. But it was moving, slowly and with intention, towards something better than it had been, because the people directing it had decided that better mattered more than impressive. And at the center of all of it, in the warm root hollow of the oldest tree in the Holt territory, two names had been pressed into the bark by the root call itself, not carved, not placed, but grown, the way things grew in living wood. Edin, Marin, not king and keeper, not Alpha and Luna, just two names, side by side, held in the oldest wood in the kingdom, in the language that only living things could read. Permanent, chosen, enough. The end. If this story found you at the right moment, if Marin's quiet dignity made you sit up a little straighter, or if Edrin's late-blooming courage reminded you that it is never actually too late, then leave a comment below and tell me which moment stayed with you. Was it the pups in the hollow? The winter assembly? Oswin and his handkerchiefs? Or that last morning in the Thornwood? And if you want more stories about people who were overlooked by the wrong world and found by the right one, you know where to find me.